Let's talk about one of the most controversial topics ever, contemporary art. You know, one of the most dramatically dissimilar experiences takes place in something that's supposed to be so unified, art. I mean, for a long time, it's just been something that we understand what it is. I mean, it's like painting, drawing, right, or sculpture. It's just something we thought we knew. Just introducing the theme of contemporary art, I mean, there's gonna be a bomb of opinions. Now, just about anything can be considered art. And it seems that, you know, the art world kind of understands what they're doing, but if we talk about the common population, who the art is supposed to be made for nowadays, let's not talk about the past. It's just kind of confusing. I mean, someone put it there in the museum. Okay, it's here in the museum, but honestly, I've had so many crazy stories where, you know, this like funny stuff where somebody put an umbrella at an exhibition and people start coming up and taking pictures of it. Yeah, that's why. That's what I mean. It's confusing. One time, my friend and I went to a museum, and it was a contemporary exhibition, and you know how those are. And like, there's just some things that you'd never thought could be on display here. Somebody got impatient with their car downstairs. Okay. So one time I went with my friend to an exhibition. It was contemporary. And then, I mean, there are just some, I don't know, roadblocks with mud next to them and then some ribbons. And then we get to the end of the exhibition and then there's like a fire exit. So like an emergency exit, which steps should you take in order to exit? And then she just stares at it for like a good 5 minutes and I'm looking over at her. I'm like, what are you doing? And she goes, well, I'm looking at this exhibition piece. And I go, it's a fire escape. And then, you know, facepalm. Course. A lot of laughs, a lot of funny things, but yeah, that should be concerning. So stories like these have understandably caused quite a bit of outrage, especially in the more conservative communities and just people out there who just don't understand what's going on. And of course, maybe most importantly for those people, or just most importantly for anyone who might think that, I don't want to put anyone in any groups, is outrageously, these pieces are sold for just some crazy amounts of money. I mean, it looks like something you could do in 15 minutes made you something you'll never make in your whole life, you know? I understand. Actually, 13 out of 15 most expensive paintings in 2020 were crafted in the modern or contemporary era. The most expensive painting was auctioned off at $84.5 million. And then probably something more striking is after the most expensive painting in history, which is the Salvator Mundi by Leonardo da Vinci. There is debate on that too, but we'll not get into that right now. The second most expensive painting ever is actually something called Interchange by Willem de Kooning. De Kooning, I mean, you probably know his pieces if you don't Google them. That may seem something not nearly as time-consuming in Salvator Mundi, but it was sold for $300 million. Million dollars. I don't know anyone who even made that much money in their lives. So this is an important thing to talk about, honestly, and maybe something even to explain. From all of my research, let's just say even on YouTube, I have never found a satisfactory video that explained why should I respect contemporary art. I mean, honestly, the arguments are just really weak. You may find my arguments weak right now, but you know what? I'm trying, okay, and it's kind of hard. I haven't found anybody argue better. So here's the important deal that we should get. I prefer art from the Renaissance or whatever, but you know, from my personal taste. But what we need to understand is for now, for the contemporary age, is that art has shifted its definition. It's just not that simple anymore. So art is no longer a depiction of beauty. It has become something more of an embodiment of emotion, political turmoil, harshness, and sometimes even like the general ugliness of life, or just totally vice versa. It's sort of the incarnation of the artist's ideas. So because this viewpoint differs just so much from our classical understanding of what art is, should contemporary art even be considered art? Should we maybe just change what art is, how we define it? Most interestingly, is contemporary art important? So let's delve into it. Let's delve into the history of art and how we came to where we are. For most of human history, art has been concerned with the classical understanding of beauty. This comprehension kind of came from our understanding of mathematics and, geometry. One of the earliest examples of this is an artist named Polykleitos from Greece. Polykleitos was important because, unlike many of the other Greek artists, he did something that they didn't. He kind of calculated everything that everybody was trying to achieve, so the perfect proportion, and put that all together in a work called canon. The work itself is kind of lost to history, but we know Polyclitus said this. I'm going to read this as a quote. Perfection comes about little by little, paramikron in Greek, through many numbers. The underlying part of it is math. You thought you could escape math? You can't. And since then, these proportions were used to display the human body, or, other things that we would try to represent from life. And humanity has developed several techniques since then. One of some interesting techniques is called reverse perspective. This is something kind of which may be considered regression in art, but at the same time it was considered high art at the time, just again to point out how art just changed over time in history. So this reverse perspective, it didn't place things as we would normally see them. So in a building, I see it far away, and so the road kind of narrows down. No, reverse perspective is kind of in order of importance. So if you're important, you're going to be big. If you're not important, you're going to be small. And then after that, we moved on to just normal perspective. It's more known as a linear perspective. And this is what's used in Renaissance and classical art. And this is basically when the artists understood how to convey three-dimensional shapes on a two-dimensional canvas. And that's kind of when we started coming back to mathematics after some period of time between ancients and Renaissance. And so they once more started to develop a lot of techniques about how to represent these three-dimensional shapes on a two-dimensional surface. Someone who's really obsessed with that is Albrecht Dürer. Dürer is pretty famous. You've probably seen his paintings at some point. And he just obsessed over this. And he has a lot of books on this theme, and he represented his findings in like a mostly pictorial matter. There's a pretty interesting work that he did. It's called 4 Books on Measurement. He depicts 2 men trying to draw a flute. And there's kind of like a string going from the flute to like a frame that they did. And like through this they were trying to represent perspective. So not to get much into detail, basically they were using linear algebra in order to understand how to represent the shape. And there are a bunch of other examples of people who did that. Leonardo da Vinci did that. Leon Battista did that. I think you got the point. And then it kind of carried over into a more modern age. So the Impressionists and the Cubists. Paul Cézanne is quoted saying, I will read this, treat nature by the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone. And then there is Henri Poincaré's Science and Hypothesis, which was really extensively used by Cubists like Pablo Picasso. But then, if you kind of look at their paintings, they're not really representing life as it is. It started being something more of like an artist adding something more from them into the painting. So if you look into, Pablo Picasso's Cubist paintings, like Le Demoiselles d'Avignon, it's full of shapes, but it's certainly not representing reality. And the Impressionists kind of started making the impression of nature rather than actually representing as it is, kind of in a photograph sort of thing. And so that's when we get into the era of modern art, which is a rebellion against classic aesthetics and beauty. So before we delve further, let's understand that for most of human history, artists were concerned about representing 2 things, deities or human beings. Of course, there are paintings and pictures, whatever, of landscapes and buildings and things like that, but above all else, the most famous, usually you wouldn't find a landscape overtake the place of a portrait, because just portraits were more popular at the time. And then if we go back all the way to the Greeks even, or even later, they just like to represent deities. Artists like to represent gods and mythology. And of course there were factors outside of art that were influencing that. There was a lot of humanist thought, and there were a lot of poems, and the beauty of human thinking, even if we trace that back to ancient Greece, so like Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. They were all into the beauty of human wisdom. And then of course Homer and Hesiod and Sophocles, they were writing these epic poems about gods and Mountain Olympus and all that jazz. And then we went on from mythology to Christian art, so a lot of Byzantine or Middle Age Western painting was concerned with God and Christianity and representing those holy beings. And then we go into more beauty of the world, so, loving the way the earth was working. And so, putting all of this together and understanding all of these things, some of the world's most celebrated art pieces, like the Mona Lisa, The Birth of Venus, David, The Last Judgment, they can all be summarized into 3 factors. They strove to accurately represent the real world. They praise a deity or an equivalently shaped concept, so it can be a human being. And they ambitiously chose to represent the conservative definition of beauty, or what they found to be beautiful at the time, the human body, things like that. And so when Impressionism arrived, people just kind of started getting away from that. And then, outside factors like Freud and Kafka and Nietzsche and such philosophers, the popular thing was, being really depressed and atheism and the theory of evolution, socialism. And this brought forth the idea that humans are beasts among beasts. They are not really much more special than a chimpanzee or an ostrich. And they kind of naturally follow their instincts just like anybody else, right? And then the idea that the world is ugly comes forth. And it was the modern idea. It was not invented then. I mean, I'm sure people thought about the world being ugly before that, but it was pretty widely accepted that beauty may not be as straightforward as we once thought. So let's take Edvard Munch's Scream into example. It began to be a representation of universal anxiety. And then, we kind of started getting more into the ugly side of human nature. So we take the aforementioned Pablo Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the prostitutes that he represented in his painting. And I mean, usually, you think of women in art just gracefully lying on their beds and eating grapes. Here, Pablo Picasso is representing prostitutes in their full view. And they're kind of harsh figures. And they are based on, they have very large facial features. Not smooth lines, but instead very strong lines. He's using very strong lines. So it was just not a normal thing to paint for our classic definition of art. And then some people really criticized it, others didn't. And then there was that ugliness of the world, but there were other people like Salvador Dali who saw the world as joyful and cheerful and crazy. And actually he saw kind of the opposite thing. The world was too sad, so he has to make it interesting, and that's where his amazing mustache comes in. Before, it was just kind of a pure representation of the world and kind of trying to represent it as perfectly as you can. And now we're seeing our own conceptual self birthing itself on the canvas. So how we see the world is represented on the canvas, is represented in the painting, is in the work. And then, we have all these movements, abstract impressionism, pop art, neo-expressionism, appropriation, psychedelic art, conceptual art. And then the list goes on and on and on. There are just so many movements that have been, that are going to be a lot. And kind of all of that started to fall into one category nowadays known as contemporary art. And then, what's the difference between modern art and contemporary art? How did that one evolve into the other? One sociologist named Natalie Heining, she described it as the following. She said, modern art questioned the real world. Contemporary art questioned the very concept of an artwork. We can kind of criticize contemporary art as a disintegration of what art truly must be and describe it as chaotic. Or we can praise it as humanity's true discovery of an expression of inner self. Just briefly speaking, it can be interpreted as both anything and everything. Nowadays, I think we just should understand that we're in a period of transition. Considering the fact that contemporary art doesn't really have an orthodox set of rules that one must follow, it feels chaotic and it's hard to understand what are the mediums that we're using to create this art, or what is it representing, and things like that. And essentially speaking, humanity's changing. What I'm saying, it's not news, we've always been changing. But it's just important to understand that where art went now is just a result of our history. It's just the result of what we've created in our history. It's just the result of the philosophies we've followed. And it was kind of like an inevitable result. Of course, history could have gone millions of ways, but that's the path we chose, and that's the path that resulted. And there are many questions to ask about what is art. For example, should graffiti be considered art? Should some of the graffiti be considered art? Can you paint everywhere? Right? But it's just something that we're gonna have to discuss. And we just happen to be in a period of transition. And especially with globalization, so many cultures and peoples and languages are just mixing together that it's difficult to create something like it was before. Mixing our histories, and we're mixing so many things together that it's difficult to kind of unify it into one right now. Doesn't mean that it's impossible, but it just means that it's something that we have to discuss and work on. But at the same time, understand why we are here. The art that we have today, that's the art that we have created for us.